Welcome to On the Other Hand, and a special welcome to these new subscribers and any other new viewers. It's been almost a year and a half since COVID reared its head in the US. Back in March of 2020, there was a lot of talk about flattening the curve and 15 days to slow the spread for this new and unknown virus. Since we didn't know how bad things would be, these slogans and strategies were reasonable because, like any flu-like virus, everyone acknowledged that COVID couldn't be stopped, just slowed, and that it was important to prevent both overwhelming the hospitals and unnecessary and avoidable deaths. So with the talk of new lockdowns, mandates, and strains, I thought now would be a great time to look at the numbers of COVID and try to put them in perspective. Let's start with data from the CDC, encompassing deaths from COVID since 2020, broken down by age. Notice that kids aged 0 to 17 have had the least amount of deaths, and that the age group of 85 and older has had the most amount of reported deaths. Also keep in mind these are totals and not representative of per capita deaths, but that could be easily calculated. On the kids side, the CDC shows pneumonia deaths to be double COVID deaths, and for most of the other ages it seems like pneumonia deaths and COVID deaths are pretty comparable. Now I realize that pneumonia and COVID are very different ailments, but what I'm trying to do is show perspective. If death is the primary concern, pneumonia and COVID have killed about the same amount of people during this time. Now this dataset lets us filter by year, and keep in mind that because these are total deaths, 2021's data is incomplete. But we can do a basic projection of 2021 and assume the numbers will end up about 1.5 times their current value. The good news is, with that rough estimate, it seems like this year will clock in at around 20% less deaths than last year if the current trend continues. I'd say this has a lot to do with less people being susceptible due to natural immunity, vaccinations, or just that COVID has already claimed a lot of the elderly. As you can see, the oldest age range has had significantly less deaths this year, even with the multiplied estimation. Continuing on with the CDC data, here is a handy graph that charts the total deaths over time, and also by age. Note the big surge at the start, the surge in the summer, and then a big spike in the winter. We've been on a pretty consistent decline since then, and the latest little uptick in deaths is probably due in part to this new Delta variant. The CDC also has this chart that shows the excess deaths over what would be considered a normal year. We went over the curve at the first of 2018, and then we can see a familiar curve on top of the deaths of 2020 and 2021. This chart is also nice because we can select the option to separate out deaths with and without COVID. So here in green is the non-COVID deaths, and in blue is the COVID deaths. Note that 2020 and 2021 would be over the curve without the COVID deaths, but the COVID pushes it much higher. These non-COVID deaths are probably byproducts of the US's response to COVID, like deaths of despair, or hesitancy or inability to go to the doctor or to get elective surgeries. So there is a cost analysis that should be happening about those potentially avoidable excessive deaths, and if they are worth the measures taken. When does the cure become worse than the disease? You can go further into this data and have the excess deaths broken down by state if you're interested. And again, you can view it as all deaths or non-COVID deaths. And again, this is in raw numbers, so of course larger states like California will be at the top. For a comparison on these deaths, I found a vital statistics report from the year 2017 to compare deaths by cause, by age, because I was curious. And sorry, this was the most up-to-date data of this kind I found. Here on the screen are the 3 pages I'm drawing from, but I just wanted a relative idea of the leading causes of death for each age range in a normal year compared against their COVID counterparts. For the age range of 0 to 19, the most common causes of death were unintentional injuries at 6,793, and the second highest cause was suicide at 3,008 deaths. Suicide wasn't on the top 10 for kids 9 and under, but it was a big factor for teens. And the third largest was malignant neoplasms, aka cancer, responsible for 1,740 deaths. For reference, this age range had 198 deaths from COVID in the year 2020, which is a pretty stark difference. For the age range of 20 to 29, the most common causes of death were also accidents at approximately 22,300 deaths, and suicide at 7,700 deaths, with the third leading cause being homicide, which accounted for about 5,800 deaths. And for reference, the COVID deaths of that age range was 1,481 in 2020. For people in their 30s, the most common causes of death were accidents at around 24,200 deaths, 7,600 from suicide, and 7,200 from cancer, with their COVID 2020 death count at 4,287. For people in their 40s, the most common causes of death were around 25,000 deaths from cancer, 23,600 deaths from accidents, and 21,500 from heart disease, with their COVID 2020 death count of 11,318. For people aged 50 to 64, the most common causes of death was cancer at around 134,400 deaths, 96,400 from heart disease, and 35,600 deaths from accidents. And their COVID 2020 death count was 56,740. For the age range of 65 to 74, the most common causes of death were also cancer at 168,458 deaths, 116,633 from heart disease, and 39,704 deaths from respiratory diseases. Their 2020 COVID death count was 82,249. For people aged 75 to 84, the most common causes of death were cancer at 155,917 deaths, 151,249 deaths from heart disease, and 51,116 deaths from respiratory diseases. Their COVID 2020 death count was 106,201. And for people 85 years and older, the most common causes of death were from heart disease, with 251,170 deaths, 103,521 deaths from cancer, and 80,517 deaths from Alzheimer's. For their 2020 COVID death count was 122,755. I know going over these numbers is kind of morbid and sad, but I hope it gives some perspective of the deadliness of COVID versus the most common causes of death for each age range. Now, moving away from national data, I live in Utah, and we have a pretty good site that tracks statistics for my state, so I thought I would show it off here too. Here we have COVID cases by date, and this looks fairly similar to the national graph of deaths. Next we have Utah's hospitalizations. This follows a similar trajectory to the first, but the gap between the highs and the lows aren't as extreme. And finally, here's a graph for COVID deaths in Utah. And we've been hovering with an average of 3 COVID deaths a day since April, although it looks like we might be on a slight uptick. I don't know what your state looks like, but the closer you get to home, the more relevant the data will be to you. Utah also has a nice graph of estimated recovered and active COVID cases, as well as COVID deaths. Again, it's just another way to look at the data and get a bigger perspective than just the raw numbers. Utah has also broken down the case rate per capita by county, which is nice, even though they all kind of look the same. At the top of the page, Utah provides a rolling counter for all these metrics, like deaths and hospitalizations since the start of COVID. And for this, I want some points of reference as well. So here's some data from Utah about driving risks. For the year of 2020, you are about as likely to get injured in a car crash as you were to have gotten hospitalized for COVID. Keep in mind that the COVID data is almost 1.5 years worth, so we have to bring the numbers down a bit to compare accurately. But that being said, you were about 6.5 times as likely to die from COVID as you were to die in a car crash in Utah. And as a final perspective, here are some of Utah's crime rates for 2020. And you are more likely to get assaulted in 2020 than to get hospitalized for COVID, 2 to 3 times more likely to be stolen from than to be hospitalized for COVID. However, you are many times more likely to die from COVID than to die by homicide. So there's that. I know I can be a nerd for numbers, but I hope this has given you some perspective on COVID and its relative risk compared to some more familiar risks we have in our lives. On this one, I tried to keep my opinions out as much as possible so you can make the informed decisions you need to. As always, thanks, hope you enjoyed. And if you did, consider subscribing or joining me on Odyssey, a great YouTube alternative. Link is in the description.